Welcome back. Now, let's crack straight on, shall we, with our next guest, who needs a little introduction. It's the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Hello to you. Thanks for being on the show.
Morning.
Now, before we go on with the rest of the interview, I did want to give you the opportunity to respond to an interview that we did a bit earlier in the show with Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, who said that he's troubled by some of Jeremy Corbyn's past associations, some of which he finds surprising and worrying. What's your response to those concerns?
Well, I'm not surprised. Look, this is a reactionary member of the establishment. So I don't think he'd welcome a Labour government of any sort, to be frank, and I'm disappointed with him, but there you are. Can I just say to him directly, I think he should spend his retirement in quiet contemplation of the role that he played with regard to the Iraq war, where over 500,000 people, at least, were killed. He was strongly criticised as the head of an organisation whose intelligence took us into that war. So I think he should have a bit of humility about the judgments he makes about individuals and others in the future.
OK, some very strong words from you there, Mr McDonnell. Now, I want to move on to...
Well, they were strong words. They were strong words from him, with the greatest respect. And if you look at the Chilcot inquiry, his organisation was strongly criticised for its role, and he was the head of that, and it had severe consequences, which we're even living with now. So I think he should spend his retirement with a bit of humility, quite honestly.
OK. Now, I do also want to talk about the interview, or the Theresa May writing in The Observer this morning. She's making what's really an unashamed pitch for Labour voters, saying that if you're a centre-ground Labour supporter, the Conservatives are currently the party for you. She's also, of course, talked about ending austerity. I mean, are you worried about this pitch from the Prime Minister?
Well, it looks as though she's making a pitch for Labour support because she's got so little support in her own party. If you read the stories this morning, there are a group of Conservative MPs who are threatening to, well, have a coup and then not vote for her own budget. They're falling apart. So it's no wonder she's desperately looking for support, fairly cynically, from anywhere. No, I'm not worried at all. Look, this issue she announced during her speech at conference about end of austerity, they've announced it 3 times already and it's not happened. And isn't it ironic that in the very week that she announces the end of austerity, we discover that members of her cabinet are being briefed that families will lose out on £200 a month as a result of the rollout of universal credit. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies is saying 75% of the welfare cuts have still got to be rolled out over the coming couple of years. So there's no end of austerity, quite the reverse. What's happening is the austerity rolls on and people are really suffering, and some of the most vulnerable within our society.
OK, I want to talk to you about universal credit, because Labour's current policy on universal credit, which you're very open in your criticism of it, your current policy is just to pause it and to fix it. So can you not give us a clear answer now about whether or not it would be Labour's policy, in the next election, or if a Labour government would actually scrap universal credit, or if you just keep it despite your criticisms?
I think most people now are coming to the conclusion it's got to be scrapped. I've been listening to people over the last few weeks about the rollout in their particular areas. I've been looking at what the government has said, how they're seeking to reform it. The reforms haven't worked. I think we're at that stage now that it's not sustainable anymore. It's not a system that can work. It's not a system that's providing the safety net that people expect when they need support. So I think we're moving to a position now where it's just not sustainable. It'll have to go. If there were reforms that could be effective, fair enough, let's reform. But we've looked and looked, and we can't see that either government proposals or other proposals could reform it. The system is so, well, it's in shambles, and actually, I think it's actually iniquitous as well. To have a government ministers being privately briefed that families are going to lose £200 a month, and these are some of the poorest families in our community, that's just not acceptable. So I think we're moving towards a conclusion now that you can't save the thing, it's got to go.
So if that is the case, and you say that it's got to go, I mean, the principles of universal credit are hard to disagree with, which is that it should pay to be in work rather than to not be in work, and also that the system should be simplified. I mean, £1.9 billion has been ploughed into universal credit. What are you going to replace it with? I mean, it's very easy to point the finger and criticise the current policy, but what would you replace it with?
Well, that's exactly what we've been saying over the last year and since the last general election. We now need a proper consultation, a root and branch examination of how we can go forward to make sure people do get the proper support. The principles of bringing benefits together in one, so it's a much simpler system we all support. But this hasn't done that. It's made it more complex. But in addition to that, it seems to have actually penalised the very people we want to support. As I say, we've got 4 million children out there in our community. 2/3 of them are in families where someone's at work. That cannot be right. That means wages are so low and the support for them through universal credit and elsewhere is so low as well. So we've got to have a system now that really works. And now I think we've got to recognise this system isn't working. What system do we now need? And let's have an open debate, maybe a cross-party debate about how we can bring people together to re-establish a system which is a proper security net, safety net for people, where we do not have people who are on benefits but are still having to turn up at food banks. Last year, over, well, what was it, 1.25 million food parcels handed out in the 6th richest country in the world. That cannot be right. This system is not working.
Now, a little bit earlier, we were talking about Theresa May's pitch for Labour voters. At conference, both Theresa May and Sir Richard Dearlove, the Home Secretary, spoke about the fact that they admired Diane Abbott for her resilience in the face of the abuse that she receives, even though they disagree with some of her policies. So, in the spirit of trying to reach out to win over other parties' voters, can you tell me if there are any Conservative MPs that you admire?
Sorry, I didn't pick up the last piece of the question. The sound went.
I was just asking, in the spirit of reaching out to win over the opposition's voters, are there any Conservative MPs that you admire?
Well, look, to be frank, there aren't. I've worked with Conservative MPs on a cross-party basis. I've worked with David Davis on issues around human rights. I've worked with Zach Goldsmith around the issue of the third runway at Heathrow. And on those particular issues, we've worked cooperatively, etc. And yes, at times I've admired them for the courage in which they've stood up for their principles, of course. Justine Greening is another one, of course. There are people like that who, on their particular issues, have been strong and brave and courageous, and I've congratulated them for them. I've appeared on public platforms with them. But this issue about Diane Abbott, let me just say this. I find it a bit hypocritical that Sajid Javid and the Prime Minister have referred to Diane in that way, because it was the Conservative campaign, the Conservative Party campaign, that during the election said a lot of the criticisms, that set the dogs onto Diane. If you look at what happened in the media, the Tory press were abysmal, and that was set up by the Conservative Party during their campaign. They personalised the campaign because they did not want to debate the policy issues. So I find it somewhat hypocritical, I have to say.
OK, now a very quick thought from you, because we are running out of time, but I'm interested to get your reaction to the news that a prominent Saudi journalist has disappeared in Turkey after going into the Saudi Arabian consulate there. Your reaction?
It's appalling. If the information is true that's coming out, it's absolutely appalling. It's unacceptable. We, along with other nations now, should stand up to the Saudi government and make sure they know it's unacceptable. And if this means taking action in some form, we should take those actions. Okay. I've been on a number of demonstrations when the Saudi regime has sent representatives here because of human rights abuses. And if this is another example of that, we've got to be much firmer.
John McDonnell, thank you very much.